Well, I'd like to welcome everybody back to the Empower Grief Journey podcast. I'm your host, Chris Mamoni, and I'm an acceptance coach who helps people heal from grief, loss, and trauma to discover their self acceptance and step into their personal power. This podcast is your dedicated space for healing, growth, and transformation. Each episode shares insightful and inspirational stories along with practical tools and actionable insights to help guide you along your healing journey. Together, we'll explore the hidden gifts, lessons, and blessings inside grief that can empower you to reclaim your life and create an inspiring future. Today, I have Jason Tuttle with us from Georgia. Jason is a married father of two kids with multiple mental and physical disabilities, some that are rare. He's a stay-at-home dad for 12 years until his son suddenly and unexpectedly passed away from issues related to his needs on January 28th, 2022. Since that day that his son passed, he's created a website and a blog, also a community called Letters to Zachary on grief that details his raw, unfiltered, and open grief journey from a man's and a father's perspective. It's a place where men can feel vulnerable enough to share their emotions, empower women to help their grieving men in their lives, and see that it's okay to share vulnerability through his example that he went through. His community is also open to all givers. So, without further ado, I want to welcome Jason onto the show. Jason, thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. Jason and I connected a couple weeks back through a podcasting group, and Jason and I connected because he and I both experienced the loss of a child, different situation and circumstance, but we shared that bond in common. And I was very moved by your story, Letters to Zachary, and I really want to turn things over to you so that you can share that story about Zachary with us and walk us through that grief journey that you went through.
Okay, sure, certainly. It all starts kind of back. My wife and I got married. My wife is actually 3 years older than me. We got married when I was 26, she was 29. So, as you can imagine, right after we got married, starting a family was a pretty quick topic just because of our age. We were a little older than the average. I wouldn't say we were old when we got married or started a family, but not your norm per se for when we wanted to have kids. And everything was normal. Well, we got married. We got through the honeymoon period, and probably about that second year, we decided we wanted to start to have a family. So we immediately started. Didn't take us long to get for my wife to get pregnant. Everything was normal. We had no issues. Nothing that made us think that our lives were going to be any different than, say, anybody else that family that has children. And then at the week 20 appointment, we found out that my son, well, the week 20 appointment's that one where you find out the sex of the child that you're having. And it was at that ultrasound that we didn't necessarily know what was going on, but we knew there was an issue and we knew it was a big issue. And from that point, after seeing the ultrasound person and seeing the OBGYN, they referred us to a perinatologist, which is basically a high risk OBGYN, is what it is. And from week 20 until week 38, we saw the perinatologist once a week, and they told us every terrible scenario you can think of as it relates to the medical wellness of our son. They told us your son's only going to be born with one kidney, which was true. Your son, that kidney may have some damage in utero because of what they were seeing on the ultrasound, which was true. Um, After that, they said, well, your son may have hydrocephalus, which is water on the brain. And typically, the way they correct that is if you know anybody that's got a shunt in their head, the shunt helps to kind of drain that excess fluid off their brain. Luckily, that was not true. They said your son may have areas of missing white matter in his brain, and that may affect his development. It may delay him. It may do several things, and unfortunately, that was true. They also gave us several other pretty serious things that it could possibly be. Luckily, some of the other ones were not true. At about week 38, my wife started going to contractions. She had a C-section. For anybody that's had a C-section and a husband and a wife, I was in there with her. My son was born. They wrapped him up. We saw him for about 30 seconds, and then my wife had to go off and recover because the epidural was making her not feel well, which is pretty common. And they took my son to the NICU at the local hospital. It was at that point that we found out he was born with a rare condition called Eagle-Barrett syndrome, and the next day he was going to be transferred up to the local children's hospital here in Atlanta, just because they were more capable of dealing with the issues that they thought he was going to have. Um, my wife, let me backtrack. C-sections these days, for those that don't know, typically when a woman has that, you're out in 3 days. I mean, they pump you in and out. And in fact, the day after my wife had a C-section, which for anybody that knows anything about it, it's a major surgery. They said that next morning they wanted her up and walking after having a C-section. And in my blunt fashion to the doctors, I went, you gutted her like a deer not 12 hours ago, and now you want her up and walking? Why? Explain that to me. And they came back and said, well, the reason why we want her to do that is when the longer she lays down, the more prone she is to blood clots, which can be a major issue. And I said, okay. And they said, the other reason why is we've learned over the years of medical science, if we agitate the system enough, while they're starting the healing process, it'll start them to heal faster. And so that's why they wanted her up. Outside of the fact they didn't want her to get stiff from, laying around so much. And so she basically had 3 days, although since my son was being transported up to the local children's hospital, we left on day 2. She did not want to be
Hmm.
in that. And I told her, I said, look, if you want to stay the third day, that is your decision. Our son is going to be up there. I'll be here with you, or if you want me up there, I'll go up there. But I'm not going to tell you you've got to leave. If you feel like you're up to it and it's not going to hurt you, we'll do what we got to do. And she was just like, no, I want to go. And it was from that point that my son was in the NICU at the local children's hospital for, I believe it was 12 days at that point. And it was during that time that we found out that he may have, well, he was going to have neurological delays. He may have respiratory issues, which he did. He definitely had urological issues. He may possibly have something like seizures and epilepsy, which he did, and just all these different things about him. And it wasn't until about day 13 after he was born that we actually brought him home. But from that point, we had to see 6 different specialists every 6 months. And that went on probably the first 5 or 6 years of his life, is how kind of our family started. Fast forward about a year, we always knew that we wanted to have another child, no matter what was going on. And as you can imagine, when we told our families that we wanted another child, the backlash that we got. A lot of them were just like, well, you've got a son that's got so many issues. Why would you want to have a child on top of that with the possibilities of what could happen? And I came back and said, well, I've researched until I'm blue in the face, and there's nothing out there that says just because our son has these issues will guarantee anything that our next child will have any of this. Our next child could be perfectly normal, so to speak. So we went ahead, wife got pregnant pretty easily. We had our daughter, and at least initially, I hate to say it this way, but she was the normal child, meaning we didn't think she had any issues. We didn't think there was anything wrong with her. But at about 6 months, when she got evaluated, the OT came in and said, it's my professional opinion that I believe she's delayed. And as you can imagine, that's not what I wanted to hear. So I went to the pediatrician that we have for our son, and our pediatrician actually has a special needs daughter. and she saw our daughter and said, I tend to agree with them. You may want to have her start seeing a neurologist. And it was from that point that the ball started rolling, the snowball, the proverbial snowball started to roll for her. So, to give you an example, my wife had been married. By the time my daughter was born, we'd been married 4 years. And by about the fifth year, we had had two kids born within 2 years. They both were born with severe neurological delays, epilepsy. They were nonverbal. They were basically wheelchair bound. And then my son, on top of that, was born with a rare condition. So at year 5 of our marriage, we had two kids that had almost identical issues to each other, and a combination of issues that nobody within probably 1,000-mile radius around us knew how to deal with. And what I've learned now what I've learned now from everything I've experienced is, during that moment of our just family's life, I didn't realize at the time, but I was grieving during that time, not knowing I was, because I was grieving the life I thought I was going to have versus the life that we got. And for me, that was a hard pill to swallow because my son and I, when he was around, we watched sports and all that. I have a degree in physical education. I taught elementary school physical education. I thought, if he was interested in it, he would get into sports and I would help him out. And on top of that, as you can see from just me talking here, I can talk, and my son was nonverbal. And so I had to learn to communicate with him and my daughter in different ways. So a lot happened that first 4 or 5 years of just my family's life, of having to learn what to do and how to do it and how to cope with it. And, you know, I was. I was angry for a lot of years because of it. I was angry at the fact that the life that we thought we were going to have just got ripped out from under us. And when I say I was angry, it wasn't directed at anybody. It was more of an internal anger that I dealt with for a very long time. And it got to a point where I finally just started seeing a counselor because it was getting too much for me. So that was kind of the first 5 years of my wife and I's marriage.
Jason, you brought up a lot of points there that I've experienced losing a stillborn, and I share empathy with you about that life that you thought you were going to have got ripped out from underneath you. I think a lot of people that aren't lost parents don't see that a lot. They see us grieving the loss of our child, and they see that, but they don't see that we've also lost that future that we had planned for. And that's been I'll share with you. I was right there with anger with you, my friend. And it was never directed at anybody, but it was really this, why did this have to happen to me? And why did this have to
Exactly.
be my family? And
Mm.
and then, you brought up another good point that I haven't had to experience personally, but I wanted to touch on it because I found it really
Okay.
profound, is that you had a nonverbal child. And
Uh-huh.
so, we're most of us that aren't are normal. I'm going to say normal people in
Yeah.
parentheses. We're verbal people,
Mhm.
and we communicate that way. But when you have a nonverbal child, like somebody with autism, for example, you have to
Mhm.
learn other modalities to communicate.
Mhm.
And those represent a lot of challenges. They can be very, very challenging,
Mhm.
not just for parents, but also for the
Exactly.
child themselves to make sure their needs are met and actually understand their needs. And I wanted to bring that up because that's a topic that's not very well understood in my
Uh-huh.
experience of what I've seen. And if you could share a little bit about that,
Sure.
that process of what it was like to learn how to communicate differently and try to understand your child's needs from that perspective.
Sure. The hard part for my family, and more so for me, just because I was the stay-at-home parent, I did all of the physical medical care, all of the physical procedures I had to learn. When my son was in the hospital, I went with him. When he got admitted, I stayed with him. When he got discharged, I came home with him. So I was the kind of his voice for him. Um, it was really difficult in the beginning when the first 5 years it was difficult because at that point I was, what they don't tell you about some of the medical conditions that my son had, The issue there is, about all of the primary issues that are related to, say, a cerebral palsy or an epilepsy or something that people know the names of. But what they don't tell you about are some of the secondary issues that happen because of those issues. And that first 5 or 6 years, because I was learning all the things that might happen with him, it was very frustrating. It was very hard because my son was nonverbal. He couldn't, on those times I had to make an intelligent guess and decide whether I was going to rush him to the hospital or not, because he couldn't tell me, one, if he hurt, or two, where he hurt. So
Hmm.
when we had the respiratory related illnesses, I could hear something was going on, but could he say, my lungs are bothering me, or it's in my face, or I've got, sinus drainage or something like that. He couldn't tell me any of that. So I had to kind of learn it trial and error. Now, as time went on, I learned a lot of his nonverbal cues. And years ago, and getting my degree, because I've got a degree in education, and I'm in the school system, but they say that when a person talks to another person, the actual verbal words that come out of from communication is only about 5%. Like 95% of your communication are nonverbal cues. It's facial expressions, it's how you act, it's how you respond, you know, just all of those things that don't necessarily make a sound when you're talking to someone. So I had to learn those with my son. And it got to a point with my son that I was so good with it that when he would make a specific sound of cough, I knew at that point I had to start my medical protocol. I had to do kind of what I did for every 4 hours. And if I couldn't get on top of, say, one of his respiratory related illnesses, I knew I was taking him to the hospital. And there was one time I'd take him to the hospital. I had him checked out, and the ER doc that was there, he said, "I'm going to do a chest X-ray." And he does it. He comes back, and he said, "Well, he's got a little bit of congestion down in the lower right side of his lungs." And I forget what the number means, but he said the number that I'm seeing on there is 5.5, and basically that number meant the lower the number is, the lower the risk of, say, developing into a pneumonia, bronchitis, that kind of thing. And he goes, "It's 5.5 right now." And he said, "We can do one of two things." He said, "I can send you home with meds, and if something changes, you can please bring him back up, or I can have him admitted overnight for observation." And I said, "Well, because of his history with respiratory related illnesses and all of his other issues, I would prefer, at least for a night, to be admitted just in case something should happen. I don't have to drive 60 miles north, sit in the ER waiting room, and then hope to get in back here." And he was really nice. He said, "That's fine. Let me start the paperwork and get that done." So we get admitted that night, and sometime in the middle of the night, they bring in the mobile chest X-ray, and they give him an X-ray. That doctor comes back in, and the next morning he goes, "I don't know how you did it." And I said, "How did I do what?" He said, "Last night when I took the X-ray, he said the number was 5.5. He said this morning it's 19." And he goes, "You brought him in literally as the pneumonia was forming in his lungs." He said, "I don't know how you did it." He said, "You could not have brought him in any closer to pneumonia forming than what you did." And I said, "There was just a gut feeling. There was a sound I heard that I was just like, I've got to get him to the hospital." And so I got to a point to where I could tell when my son was getting sick almost before he got sick. And that's how I learned to kind of communicate with him. Yes, he was nonverbal, but like, I could ask him yes no questions, and if he wanted to do it, he would either go like he wanted to do it, or he would clap his hands if he wanted to do it. So there was a little bit of basic communication, but like to say words, no, he never said any.
That's incredible that you were able to pick up on those social cues with
Mhm.
him. That's something I've had pet rabbits for the last 13
Mm,
years now, and
mm,
they don't talk. They don't speak. They don't make noise. And when something goes wrong, it's fast and hard. And you were making me reflect on that as you were saying, the doctor saying you couldn't have timed this any better to get him in the
mm,
hospital right now,
mm.
because had you waited, it would have been worse. And
Yeah.
I think that's interesting now the timing of that happened, but just it's a real applaud to how much you paid attention to him and how you understood him and how you understood the cues that he chose to communicate in. I think that's really powerful to have learned all that.
Certainly. I mean, over the years, I had a ton of nurses that would come in and say, "You are the most informed parent I've ever come across." And I said, "Well, my son's nonverbal. He can't tell you." I said, "So I have 15 years worth of medical knowledge in the back of my brain that I can pull up at a moment's notice. Because the more I can tell you about the patterns that he experiences, the better you can treat him and care for him to get him out of here." And so that's why I know all of that. And so, yeah, I got to where I knew his mannerisms, I knew his patterns, I knew everything that he did. I mean, I knew everything about him so that when I got into the hospital, I was prepared for when doctors came in there.
I think that's just a real testament to, just being a good caregiver at that
Mm,
point. I can't share enough. I've spent a lot of time in hospitals since 2017,
mm,
with various family members, and
mm.
there's something to be said about what you just talked about, is that you end up in these situations like when my grandfather got cancer. I mean, I knew how to operate the IV pumps. I knew how
Yep.
to the language of it. I knew what
Mhm.
the numbers meant. I knew XYZ about whatever was going on. And I had that same thing happen. The nurses for my grandfather were like, "How do you know all this stuff?" And I said,
Mhm.
"I've been in the hospital so much. I've listened to all this jargon. I've
Mhm.
heard you guys explain this, this,
Yep.
and this, and how it all works." And so now I'm like an expert,
Yep.
self-proclaimed expert, as you just, demonstrated to us with that.
Mhm.
Um, I wanted to ask you, it sounds like you went through a lot in that process of
Mhm.
just, I mean, you had a child that was nonverbal. You had to learn the communication on that front. You've then
Mhm.
got this other side of things that you had to learn all this medical knowledge about
Yep.
this treatment, this disorder,
Mhm.
this disease. How do we treat this? What do we watch for?
Yep.
I can't imagine just how much, mental capacity and stress that puts on someone, and let alone how do you navigate that? I know you brought up that anger was a part of the process, but how did you keep yourself in that place of just being present and being such a good caregiver? I think there's a testament to that.
Um, well, first of all, and I'll make this statement because it's probably a pretty generalized statement for most men. I'm pretty damn stubborn. And when I decide that I want to do something, I'm one of those, if I'm going to do it, I'm 150%. If I'm not going to do it, I'm 0%. There's not a whole lot of middle ground with me. On a side note, I deal with anxiety, depression, and ADHD, so that plays a factor into all of that. Outside of the fact that I've just got, when I decide something, my wife would tell you I have a ridiculous drive, if you will, to get things done. And, you know, it was a very steep uphill curve in the beginning. Um, I lived, and even to this day, unfortunately, lived a very high stress life. um, One, because I was always on edge for my son. Um, from the day we brought him home to this day, I still don't sleep well because there were several times overnight when he was younger that I literally heard him in his monitor. I woke up, I got him dressed, and I floored it to the hospital. So from those moments, I never really slept well. And like if I don't have medicinal help for sleep, I just won't sleep. I mean, unfortunately, it's a side effect of just the life we've lived. I mean, I don't say it to complain about it. It just, it is what it is. So, very high stress for me because, even though, I was taking it, it was still my son. And so I, there were a couple of times before he actually passed that I saved his life. Um, So you always have that in the back of your mind that none of my son's conditions were considered um, fatal, but they were chronic. And anybody that has a child with chronic conditions, you don't think they're gonna eventually succumb to them. But at least for me, it was always a very small, minute in the back of my brain that it was a possibility. And so I never expected it to happen, although it did. Um, but to deal with all that, I'm not proud of it. There were a lot of nights when he went to bed and I finally had moments to relax and all that. I didn't go overboard, but I did drink to take the edge off. Um, I will tell people my drink of choice was bourbon. Was a huge fan of it. Um, just because life during the day was so, I told people all the time that I lived in go mode 24/7, 365. I never turned off. And I did that for his whole life. So 15 plus years. And even still to this day, it's hard for me to turn off because I've done it for so long. And yeah, his sister's still around, and whereas she doesn't have the rare conditions, she has all of the other conditions that I have to kind of be aware of and what's going on and how's she doing, and should something arise, what do I do once they arise? Um, I will say that the positive note is I haven't drank in years. For those that might be concerned, um, I gave that up a very long time ago. Um, but yeah, that was a lot of how I coped. There was a lot of internal anger that kind of how I coped. But I eventually got to a point to where I started seeing a counselor, and I'm a huge proponent of counseling or therapy, whatever someone may use. I believe that we all go through seasons where we may need a professional just for us to bounce our whatever off of them and for them to give their professional experience of what they feel like things that we could do to help get through it. And so for a year plus towards the end of my son's life, I saw her once a week. And honestly, that was my saving grace because it was affecting my family, it was affecting my marriage, it was affecting everything. And it was the counseling and the therapy was what I needed. It was the proverbial 2x4 up to my forehead is what it was. And I will be the first to tell you I needed it. I mean, I needed it so hard you could have flipped me over the couch is what I needed. And
Well,
that's kind of the thing that got me over the hump.
Well, Jason, I just want to say you hit on multiple things there that I'd love to elaborate on. Is that
Sure.
first off, I want to say thank you for being just vulnerable enough to say what your coping mechanism was. And I'm
Yeah.
going to tell you right now, my podcast is a judgment-free space. This is not
Oh,
here to judge people. This is to say this is raw and open truth
yeah.
for what people go through. And
Mhm.
I being a lost parent as well, I've talked to many people in that community, and we all have our vices in that moment. And I
Oh, yeah.
think that, people resort to drinking, some people do drugs, some people end up in situations where they end up in violent or DUI, whatever it
Yep.
is. And I try to share with people that, especially being a lost parent, it's
Yeah.
hard. It is very,
Mhm.
very hard. When you end up in that place, like you said that you're on 24/7, 365. Your brain doesn't have time to slow down. You don't even have space
Mhm.
to slow down. You don't have time to
No.
relax. I've tried to tell people in the grief process too that when I lost my son, I had a hard time sleeping. I had a hard time relaxing after I lost him for
Hmm.
months. I
Yep.
couldn't chill out. There was no shut it off. There was no life as normal. That didn't exist. And so, I share out there, like you said, going to counseling, going to therapy, going to coaching, like what I do, is very, very helpful. It doesn't
Yep.
mean that there's something wrong with you. It's the complete
Mhm.
opposite of that. It means that there's something in your life missing that you need help with, and that's
Uh-huh.
okay. There's nothing wrong
Yep.
with that. And so to give yourself permission in that circumstance to say, I need an hour with somebody where I can just focus on me for once and
Yep.
try to work through what I'm going through in a safe, non-judgmental space,
Hmm.
to process my emotions, process my thoughts, process my feelings of this, try to make sense of what I'm going through. I think we all need somebody that doesn't know us very well, a third party, to help us work
Sure.
through that. And that's just part of the human experience.
Sure.
I can say that. Um, when you do find yourself though in those therapy sessions, it gives you that breathing room to finally say, I can
Hmm.
finally look at this for once. I can finally say, maybe there's this one or two thing that I can minorly change that'll make this a little more bearable for me right
Hmm.
now, or a little more understanding, so to speak. And even, the topic you brought up about anger too. I love that you brought that up. I've learned it really how I lost my grandfather, and I learned some stuff about anger. When I lost my son, I learned it even more, that
Yep.
anger is the part of you that loves you the most. It's not a negative thing. People think
Hmm.
anger is negative. It's not. It's a secondary emotion. And
Yep.
though that anger is the part of you screaming to feel heard, to feel understood, to feel seen.
Hmm.
Um, I've told people in the grief space all the time that us grievers don't want to be fixed. We'll figure that out.
Yeah.
We just want to be heard because we're
Yep.
we're going through so much pain. And I just want to say I appreciate you sharing what you did about your coping strategy and going to
Sure.
counseling and taking that action, because like you said, when you don't take those actions, it starts affecting your marriage. It affects your life
Yep.
in so many ways. And I just appreciate your vulnerability sharing that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So Jason, I wanted to ask, you feel free to talk about as comfortable as it may, or
Okay.
uncomfortable as it may be. I know losing Zachary was a really hard part of that process.
Sure.
If you wanted to touch on that a little bit, so I wanted to learn about how you became, what led you to Letters of Zachary. I wanted to figure out that process.
So after about year six of my son's life, we started getting into a stretch where we were having a lot less hospital stays. It was a lot more upswings versus downswings in his life. Now we still had the occasional thing here and there throughout the next numerous years, but nothing like it had been in the first 5 or 6 years. And then 3 days before my son passed away, both my kids came home because they're both in self-contained special education classrooms. So I get a bus directly in front of my house because they're both on a lift bus because they're both in wheelchairs. And the typical routine is I get them both in, I get them out of their wheelchairs. I change them, I get them kind of in their lounge where I get them their snacks and things. We lounge for a while, then I cook dinner. I feed, I feed them. We lounge a little bit more. I get them ready for bed, and then usually I would put my daughter to bed first, and then I would give my son actually another about an hour to give him some one-on-one time, just because I love my daughter, but my daughter can be intense. And no, though my son never talked, there were times he gave me looks of just this, I need a break from her. And I would laugh about it. And so that's ultimately one of the reasons why we would put her to bed first and let my son stay up a little while longer to have just one-on-one time with mom and daddy. Well, that night I fed him. He ate like a horse. And we had our lounge time, and my wife went to go brush his teeth, and he threw up a little bit. Didn't think much about it. We thought, she went too far with the electric toothbrush, kind of hit his gag reflex, and something came up. It didn't even phase me, and so we cleaned him up, put him to bed. Now my son was always a great sleeper. Well, that night he was up and down literally all night. At that point, the next morning, I texted his teacher, said, "Hey, I'm keeping Zachary home. I think he may have a 24-hour bug. I don't know if he's contagious. I don't want to spread it to the room. I'm gonna keep him home." And they were always great. Okay, wonderful. We'll see him. See, that was Wednesday. So that was Thursday. And she said, "Okay, we'll see him on Friday." I said, "Great." Got up the next morning, got my daughter on the way, and then got my son up. And that whole day on that Thursday, like I put him in his favorite spot on the couch in his favorite chair, and he absolutely refused to take a nap. And I kept telling him, "Buddy, You can take a nap. You're not missing anything. Daddy's just going to be on the couch on his laptop getting, working things done. You're not missing anything. But he refused to take a nap. And at least that first day, he refused to drink and eat a whole lot, which didn't really strike me. Because, at least that first day when I'm sick, I don't really want to eat or drink either. And I told my wife, I said, well, if he's doing this tomorrow, which would have been Friday, I said it'll catch my attention because that'll be two back-to-back days. And I said, even though I've been sick and I don't want anything that first day, that second day in my brain, I kind of go, well, I need to at least drink something. And I said, so I'll watch out for it. Well, that night we did the same routine. And so instead of putting my son to bed an hour later, I put him to bed at the exact same time, and he immediately got quiet. And I just looked at my wife and said, he's got to be exhausted. He didn't sleep the night before. He was up all day. He had to have been up like 40 continuous hours. And so he had to just be exhausted. So we went to bed that night, didn't think anything about it. That next morning, I looked at my wife. I said, I'm going to keep him home today, which was Friday. I said, if worst comes to worst, we've got the weekend for him to recover. He'll go back on Monday. Teacher was great about it. She said, okay, we'll see him on Monday. Got his sister up, same thing, got her off to school. Went into his room about 9:30 that morning, and typically when I'd go into his room, he would bounce and clap and be excited to see me or his mother and want to get out of bed. Well, I went in there and he was kind of awake. He was awake and he looked at me. I wouldn't call him lethargic, but he just kind of blank stared at me, which kind of caught my attention. I went over to the right side of his bed and I noticed he had a dark green streak of fluid coming out of like the side of his mouth because he'd lain on that side. And I looked at it and I looked at his mother and I went, that's not good. And she goes, well, what's not good? I said, he's got a dark green streak coming out of his mouth. And I said, the only thing I know in your body that's dark green is bile. And why is it coming out of his mouth? I said, this is not good. So I get him out of bed and I pick him up and he's kind of floppy, like he can't hold himself up. That didn't really strike me just because there'd been some respiratory stays like he was that way. When I picked him up, I went, he doesn't look like he's feeling really well. Something's not right. So I get him out in the living room. I go through my kind of mental medical protocol and I go through all my steps. I listen to his chest. I don't really hear anything. I give him a catheter to drain his bladder. I don't get much out. I feel around. Nothing really stands out to me. But the one thing that I did notice was I felt his midsection, and typically, because of his rare condition, his midsection was kind of spongy and really pliable, if you will. And I went to go press on his midsection, and it was rock hard, like cinder block brick rock hard. And I look at my wife and I go, this is not right. Something's wrong. And in that moment, as time's going by and everything's speeding around me, and my brain is slowing down, and I go, okay, I've checked this, that's fine. I've checked this, that's fine, but this is not right. What do I want to do? And just on a hunch, I went, I'm going to take him up to the children's hospital because something's not right. I said, this is out of my wheelhouse. I don't know what this is. I'm going to get him checked out. And I looked at my wife as we were getting him dressed and I said, most likely we're going to get admitted. We'll be in for our typical 7 to 10 days. Okay, fine. Because my wife was working at home at that point. Get him in a van. I do like 90 miles an hour up to the hospital because I don't know what's going on. I get in the parking deck. I get his chair out. I get him out, and he's really floppy. And this catches my attention. I went, something's really not right. So I strap him in his chair and I run up to the ER. I get in there and there was a line like a queue to go through and I skip it to like go to the desk because I think something's really wrong. Security guard comes over to me as if to say that you need to get him back in line. And before he can open his mouth, I go, I don't think he's breathing. I need help immediately. And the nurse hears me. She comes over, looks at me, she goes, follow me. I've been in this hospital 100 times. And this is the first time I've ever been asked to run from the front of that ER room to a trauma room as fast as we could get back there. So we get in the ER trauma room. I instinctively take him out of his chair. I put him on the gurney that's in there. And I back out of the way and hope that they will let me stay in there because he's nonverbal. He can't tell him what's going on. So luckily, there's another trauma room butted up to it that the doors are open and nobody's in there, and I back away in there. Well, they come in there and they immediately cut his clothes off. They intubate him, put the tube down in him to get like oxygen in his lungs. And the first thing they do is they drill something into his with no anesthesia. They drill something into his knee, literally like a drill. And the ER doc comes up and I go, "What was that?" And to someone, and they go, "That's a port so that we can get strong antibiotics in them to kind of help them along because we don't quite know what's going on yet." And I said, "Okay." But even though it didn't register in my brain in the moment, I go, he had something drilled into his knee, into the bone with no anesthesia, and he never flinched. To a normal person, you would have come off that table. It would have been excruciatingly painful. Like, so painful, you would have probably passed out. It would have been so painful. So they do that, and then not 2 minutes passes by, and they start chest compression. They start doing CPR on him. Head ER doc comes over to me and goes, "Explain to me to the minute how long he's been this way." I tell her, she goes off, barks orders, comes back to me, and she goes, "Explain to me the scenario as to why you felt like you needed to bring him up here." And I told her, she goes off and barks orders, and they start doing their thing. Excuse me. No more, and I'm watching, and two guys are going back and forth, doing chest compressions, trying to revive him. I'm looking at this, and even though I'm seeing it, it's not registering in my brain the severity of what's going on right in front of me. They'd been doing about 3-ish minutes, and all of a sudden I see them get the paddles out. They put the nowadays, instead of the old paddles where you put like the gel in between them, now it's like stickers they put on, over your heart and on your side, and they yell clear, and they hit that button. He literally like a medical drama. He raises off the table. I look at the monitor that goes over heart rate and respiratory and pulse and all that, and it literally goes boop and goes right back to what it's doing. And in that moment, I go, he's not coming back. But it still doesn't register with me. I go, he's not coming back. And I just keep watching what's going on. Well, throughout this whole process, they probably shock him 4 more times, and it's all the same result. And so finally, towards the end, or at least in that moment, I didn't realize it was the end. The head ER doc comes over to me and goes, "We could shock him again, but I think the result will be the same." And I said, "This is out of my medical wheelhouse. Do what you think is medically necessary or professional." And I think they did it again. That's the one thing I don't know. I don't remember if they did or not. And so they got through that, and she pronounced him. And as you can imagine, she offered her condolences. I turn and go into the other room, and I have a moment to myself. And when I say a moment, like 2 minutes, and I immediately shut it off and I compartmentalize it, and I turn back around and I make a phone call and I call his mother. Now she's thinking he's gotten admitted and we're in a room. I had to tell her that he was dead on a table. Um, I tell people all the time, I will never forget the sound she made when I told her that. She was working from home. She had her moment. And when she regained her composure for a second, I said, "Get a hold of your boss, leave work, call your parents, have them drive you up." I said, "You need to be up here, but you don't need to be driving." And so that's what she did. And then I called my mother at that because my parents had watched the kids several times when they were younger. And I'll never forget the response my mother gave. Now, later on down the road, my mother asked me, she goes, "I'm curious, how soon after Zachary passed away did you call me?" And I said, "About 10 minutes." And she said, "You were eerily calm." She said, "You were so calm, it was like nothing had happened." And I said, "Well, in that moment, I had to compartmentalize." And I said, I'm not making fun of myself, but if I were a blubbering idiot in that moment, I wouldn't have been able to tell y'all what had gone on." And so I get off the phone with them, and the care team comes in and they offer their condolences. And I look right at her and I go, "This is going to sound harsh and callous, and I don't mean it to be." And I point at my son and I go, "I will deal with him in a minute. I said, the thing that will help me right now is I need information." And she goes, "Okay, what do you need?" And I rapid fire off like literally 20 consecutive questions. You know, are they going to do an autopsy? If they are, what's the turnaround time? If not, where does it go? Who do I need to call up here for a funeral home? All your kind of standard questions. And so she goes off and does that and comes back and says, "Well, they're not going to do an autopsy." I said, "Well, why aren't they going to do one?" And she came back and said, she said, typically in a children's hospital, she said, there's only a few reasons why they would. She said, if your son had come in here completely healthy and then he passed away, they would want to do an autopsy. If it were criminally related, drug related, abuse related, they would want to do an autopsy on all those. But since your son has such a extensive history, medically speaking, they're just going to relate it to one of his medical conditions. And I said, I'm okay with that. And what I tell people, at least in that moment, yeah, even though I was an emotional man, I was still devastated in that moment. But I tell people, I said, the two things I remember that were the hardest things I've ever done was after my wife had come and we'd spent time with him and we decided to leave and we said, we're going to call a funeral home to, come get him, that kind of thing. I had to take all of his cut off clothes, pile them up into his wheelchair, his empty wheelchair, and roll that through the hospital. That was the hardest walk I've ever had to make. And then we had to get into our van and we had to drive 60 miles home. That was the longest, quietest um, drive I've ever had. Now, in subsequent days, we did all the funeral stuff and all that kind of stuff. And that could be a whole nother podcast.
J- Jason, I just want to say I appreciate your vulnerability to share that story. It's I'm at a loss for words with that because I faced similar emotions and feelings you did when I lost my son. It's just hard to put in context
Oh, yeah.
how sorry I am to
Well,
hear that
thank you.
that's what happened. Just know that my empathy and my heart goes out to you and your family and Zachary for what happened.
Oh, well, thank you.
That's very traumatic, and
Mm-hmm.
I bless you for being there for him in that moment because I think he appreciated that more than he was able to communicate to you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I I wanted to ask you because we're in a place to wrap up here,
Yeah.
unfortunately, but I wanted to ask you um, letters to Zachary. You shared
Yes.
that a little bit about me. Talk to me really about that process, how you came to letters to Zachary, and tell me a little bit about the book you made for him.
Okay. Well, the condensed version of it is uh, it, the way I started was journaling. It was a counselor's suggestion. She suggested it to me, and I honestly fought it for 9 months after the fact. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to be associated with it. But ultimately, what had happened was I was watching something on Facebook that like it gut punched me, and I lost it. I was just, sobbing because something in like a Facebook reel or something that related to my son just caught my attention. And so I just opened up a Word document and literally wrote out a letter in proper Oxford English style. Dear Zachary, wrote the date, and I just verbally vomited on a page. I did that several times a day for several weeks. And then one day I got this idea in one of the grief groups I was in. I asked the admin if I could share it. And she said, "Yes, we would love for you to." We rarely get men in here willing to share their emotions relating to grief. I did. I got a massively positive response, and I've said to this day, if I hadn't have gotten that response, I wouldn't be sitting in this position today because it was because of that response that made me go, well, hey, maybe I have something here. And so I kept building on it. And when you do it enough times, you start getting people going, that, especially if they like your writing, they go, well, have you ever thought about doing a book or a podcast? Or they give all your standard kind of things everybody does. And at the time, I wasn't in the brain space for it. And it was someone said, well, would you ever consider doing a Facebook page? And at the time, I didn't know what they meant by that. And they explained it to me. And they said, well, you're not going to be creating new material. You're just going to be basically copying, pasting at this point until you run through it. And then at that point, you're going to be creating new material. And at that point, I'd had weeks of stuff. So it wasn't like I was having to create on the fly. And from that point, I started building a following. I started connecting to big names in the grief community, and they were giving me pointers of what to do and what not to do based on the direction I wanted to go. And it just blew up from there. And so the first one is Letters to Zachary on Facebook, which was my primary one. And it still to this day is I share it everywhere, but I share it on the Facebook page first, honestly, because that's where I built everything. But I started on Facebook. I moved to Instagram, doing kind of meme style grief related stuff and commentary related to it. And then I got onto TikTok, and honestly, I can't believe at my age I'm on TikTok, but here I am. And I like being on TikTok because I can do 2, 3 minute short videos. Like when I get random questions in my head that are grief related, I'll go on and post something and then try to get replies from the grief community. And then I'll come back and make another video with a person's reply in the corner, and I'll reply to it online and kind of get the back and forth with people kind of in real time doing that. And it's only been recently, probably in the last 7 or 8 months, that I made a professional website. It's also letterstozachary.com. And that you can find the About Me section, the media appearances I've been on, the publications I've been in, uh, kind of the things I can talk on. Because eventually I'd like to be able to speak on a stage, like in front of people versus a podcast per se, is what kind of one of my goals is. And I mean, I've got resources on there, and you can get all of my social media links and that kind of thing. So that's what the website's for. And then last but not least, I always knew that I wanted a tangible thing that I could hold in my hands as a legacy for my son. And so I got to talking to a publisher that I met through, I think, the same podcasting group that we connected in. We got to talking, and she said, well, I think I can help you out. Have you ever thought about publishing something? I said, well, I don't know if I'm at the point of doing a book. And she goes, have you ever thought about doing a coloring book? And I thought, well, that's a unique idea. I think I like it. And so after we talked for several months, we created a coloring book, and it's the Letters to Zachary coloring book. Uh, uh, Make sure if I can get it to focus. The Letters to Zachary coloring book, and that the way that came about was we made up kind of a temporary website. We put a survey on it for anybody that had lost a loved one, and they would fill it out. And it didn't cost anybody anything, and they could put their loved one, where they were from, and the idea was they could put all these different attributes about their loved ones. That got sent to the publishers and the illustrators, and they would take the information that they gave and they would either make a collage of stuff that related to their loved one or a physical page. Like for example, my father did this one, his page for what he did, and now they can color that page that he did. On the subsequent page, the information that they put on there, they wrote on there so that anybody that purchases the book can read a little excerpt about the person that's listed on the page subsequent to it. So they can learn a little bit about the loved one that's there. And even though probably the first 5 or 6 entries are either me or kind of my family in there, every other person in there I've either known personally or I've met online through the grief community, because what I wanted to do was to make a living, active, and interactive memorial for anybody that was in this coloring book, as well as for anybody that may have lost a loved one recently. They can now, is it like a textbook? No. This is basically for for people that have lost a loved one. They can see this and know that there are other people out there that may have lost a child at the exact same age as they did, and it's more of one of those. you're not alone. We're out here. We understand it. There is a community of us. And last but not least, I still have Zachary's sister, and I thought, what can I do to help ease her mind as I'm trying to explain this to her? And coloring came up because one, who doesn't like to color? And then two, coloring is a de-stressing activity. It's a mindfulness activity. It's something that can get your mind focused on other things. While me as the parent, it gives me time to think of ways to simplistically tell my daughter about what happened to her brother. And so it's kind of got several folds to it. For those that are watching the podcast, if you like that, if you'll go to my website, letterstozachary.com, it's either the third or fourth section down. You'll see the picture of the cover of it. And if you scroll, and right next to it or either right below it, there's a button. If you press that button, it goes directly to the Amazon page.
Jason, that's really beautiful. I appreciate you sharing that with us today because I couldn't think of a better way for you to honor and celebrate Zachary's life by creating this outlet for other families that have lost a loved one or even a child for
Sure.
that matter. I just want to say, as we got to wrap up today,
Sure.
I want to say thank you so much for sharing Zachary's story with us and
Thank
just
you.
I really just appreciate you giving him some space on this podcast today because I know that your story and his story are
Mhm.
going to help change lives for other people
Mhm.
that go through similar circumstance. And
Mhm.
I think one of the most powerful takeaways I had today listening to your story is that that was a very traumatic, very hard
Mhm.
experience. And it doesn't always have to be something bad. It can be a very celebratory thing that can be given back to other people who are going to
Mhm.
face that kind of trauma and grief in their
Mhm.
life as well. So I want to end this podcast by giving honor to Zachary's life. I want to honor your
Mhm.
story as well. And I just want to say that I think his impact he's made in the world while he's not physically here, he
Mhm.
is touching lives across the world right now with
Certainly.
his legacy and his story. And I think that's such a beautiful celebration of his life. So I just want to say thank you to both of you.
Well, thank you for having us. I really appreciate it.
And I want to thank all of our listeners today. Thank you for joining Jason and I on this episode of the Empower Grief Journey. I want you guys to just take a moment, if you have listened to this show, to think about Zachary and honor his life and what Jason's giving back in the grief community because it's a very, very impactful way to celebrate his life.
Mhm.
I want you guys to remember the Empower Grief Journey is all about honoring your journey, embracing your emotions, and finding strength in your own time. If this episode resonated with you, I'd like to invite you to subscribe by visiting my website, empowergriefjourney.com, and follow me on Facebook and YouTube so you guys can have access to these episodes whenever you need it. But more importantly, if you know somebody that could benefit from this episode, please share it with them. There's a lot to be learned from Jason's conversation about Zachary today and how to help you move through grief. I also want to say that to everybody listening to this, you're never alone on this journey, and together we can navigate grief with courage and compassion. Until next time, be kind to yourself and take the grief journey one step at a time.